Alright, right off the rip, I'm going to ask a question. How does one do a sequel? Nintendo, and many other game developers, asked this question a lot back in the NES days. Even now, some studios have some trouble with this kind of a question. Do people just want more of the same? Will they like that, or should we keep it fresh and interesting by making some changes? What is the heart of our series, and how do we convey that to the player? These are questions that I think every developer asks at some point when the proposition or question of a sequel comes up. Nintendo, in the NES days, much like almost every other developer back then, had a bit of trouble with this. They tried just making more of a game with the Famicom Super Mario Bros. 2, or as we know it here in the US, the Lost Levels. It was just more Mario, but made to be more difficult. Was that good? Is that what people wanted? We didn't even know about that change until Super Mario All-Stars on the SNES. Even then, unless you were in the know, you might not have realized that the version of Super Mario Bros. 2 that we got was, well, not right. You could see that across the board with early sequels back then. So, what then? What do we do with Zelda 2? More of the same? Make the same move they did with Mario? I mean, Zelda was supposed to be the opposite of that, right? If that's the case, why not take a chance and see where that lands? Let's dive in and see where 1988 Nintendo landed with what is sure to become one of the greatest series ever made. How's it going, everyone? My name is Leon, and I want to welcome you all back to The Legend of Zelda Retrospective. Alright, let's talk development. The game was released in January of 1987 in Japan. A nice, short turnaround from the original game. Development was handled, for the most part, by the same figureheads. You had Miyamoto and Tezuka as producer and story writer, respectively. Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura as directors, and they brought on Akito Nakatsuka as the composer, who did a wonderful job, might I add. The music in this game is pretty stellar. That temple theme in particular gets remixed and remade more than you would think. At any rate, the game was designed from the ground up to be very different from the original, and with all 10 people in Nintendo R&D for running the show, it was sure to come out to be a great hit. Honestly, the fact that they switched up the gameplay that much, it's crazy to even consider that these games are related. Some early notes that I found, though I wasn't able to verify it as thoroughly as I would have liked, said that it was supposed to be a whole different game entirely. At some point, they decided to make it a proper sequel, and they gave Link, like a age up, time skip, if you will, to about 16 years old. That's right, Link was about 10 years old in the original, killed Ganon, this giant pigman wielding the Triforce of Power at 10 years old. Crazy. Young Link indeed. It was after that choice was made that Zelda 2 was officially on deck for the NES. It didn't hit the PAL region until September of 1988, and it didn't come to the shores of America until, well, December of that year. Almost 2 years after the initial release in Japan. Strange that the PAL region got the game first. That almost never happens. Really, that's kind of the long and short of it. Dev notes are kind of scattered and hard to track down. I'm sure there are more than a few interviews out there that might dive a bit deeper into the dev cycle of the game, but being it was the late 80s, unless you know how to translate a Famitsu article, I don't think you're going to be getting much. Outside of that, we're working with memories that are nearing 40 years old at this point, so some information might not be as clear as it should be. Alright, so you want to talk about some changes? Let's talk about gameplay. This is where we begin to explain what this game is. It changes so much stuff. Basically everything. Instead of being a top-down perspective, they swapped it for a 2D side-scroller look. What does that change? Well, everything, really. It quite literally changed how you view and approach the game world. This title made the bold choice to integrate RPG-like mechanics into the core gameplay. That's right, Link can level up. Some enemy giving you the biz? Go and stab some bats for a minute or two. Get that attack power up, and then come back and wreck them. You can literally grind out experience levels if you really wanted to. Sometimes these levels could come in pretty clutch. You can literally get a full life bar out of a level up, or a magic bar if you want. The only stat that doesn't immediately have a huge benefit is the attack stat. It does reduce the time it takes to take out foes, but it doesn't provide instant healing or instantly fill up your magic so you can cast the healing spell. Right, spells. Link can learn a bunch of magic spells to help out in the adventure. None more valuable than maybe the shield spell, which improves defense, but only on a per-screen basis. That's the one downside to the spell, but if you know a huge fight is coming up, then you are all set. The other great spell is the life spell, which heals you. This is near mandatory to have ready at all times, because things hurt and are sometimes difficult to attack. Some spells have minor applications, reflect, spell. Yeah, there's a spell called spell in the game. It's a strange one for sure. I don't know all the use cases for it, but it does some pretty wacky things. Fairy, jump, and fire round out the rest of the spells, each one doing what it might suggest. Jump makes you jump higher, and fire has you shoot a fireball from your sword. And fairy, well, fairy turns you into a fairy, and you can fly around the screen. You can also slip between some key locks during this. Great for certain speedrun tech, and or if you don't have any keys in a palace. The last spell is Thunder. It's a very expensive spell, but it has a ton of power behind it. It's also needed to beat the game, so make sure you have it before you enter the Grand Palace. Similar to spells, Link can learn some new sword techniques, the down thrust and, well, the up thrust. These take no magic to use, and once found, can be used while jumping and or falling by pressing up and down on the D-pad. While we're talking about the D-pad, Link is capable of moving in 2 directions when in a town, palace, or enemy instance, and 4 directions on the world map. This game has a world map, unlike the original, which was kind of just one continuous world, both on the surface and in the dungeon areas. This game has 2 sets of map types. The main overworld map, which can be traversed similarly to the original game, complete with secrets, and instance maps. Instance maps include towns, palaces, and some random blocks out on the overworld. Right, enemy encounters. Unlike the first game where you could just kind of see the enemies and you can just walk up to them, give them the old stab. On the world map, if you walk off the road paths, even sometimes on the paths, you'll spawn a trio of enemy encounters you could have. A small one, which has fairly easy enemies to defeat, a big one, which has more powerful enemies to deal with, and rarely, fairies, which, when encountered, has a fairy for you to collect, which heals you. Nice touch. It's good to know a few things about these spawns. You can trigger multiple of these at once. You can spawn a set of 3, then after walking for a while without bumping into anything, a second set of those will spawn. This typically doesn't happen often, they don't overlap very often, but when they do, it can be kind of chaotic. Either you outrun them, and or they just despawn after a short while. That said, they will bump into you at some point, and where you run into them matters. Grasslands make the fight pretty easy, woods are a little more difficult, but not too bad. Swamplands are terrible, mostly because of the slow movement speed, but basically every biome, I guess, has its own arena for combat. By far the best, though, is the road. If you get into a combat encounter on the road, you get no fight. It just kinda gets in the way and slows down the overworld movement. It's more annoying than anything, really. Be careful with that road, though. If you bump into a fairy, you'll get nothing, just like you will with the enemy fights. Alright, so, combat. Link has a few attacks. The up and down thrust, sure, but, more importantly, your basic attacks, which, just like the first game, is kind of like a stab attack. You can do that in two different heights. You got chest height stab and shin stab. Get comfortable with those two attack heights. That's really all you're going to be getting. There are a bunch of enemies that you will fight that have shields, and they will block your attacks. They'll bounce right off of those shields. So attack accordingly. If they're blocking high, attack low. If they're blocking low, attack high. Most of those enemies with shields also attack at two different heights, the same two as you, which is good to know. Just like them though, you can block the attacks with your shield if you're set at the right height. Get used to crouching mid-combat. A bunch of late game fights kind of look like this. It can be a bit much, really. Alright, so you know how I said you have two attack heights? Well, that was only somewhat true. There is another. The third attack height, the jump attack. This is somewhat more of a, quote, advanced attack. But really all it is timing your attack as you land from a jump. It's important to know that I mean a regular stab attack, no up or down thrust involved with this. If done correctly, you can basically attack through the enemy shield even if it's at the right height to normally block. Doing this still comes with a bit of risk. If you don't time it just right, you can and often will get hit, but when done correctly, you can take out some of the toughest things in the game with relative ease. This also applies to certain bosses, by the way. Very fun trick. Just like in the first game, if you're at full health, you'll fire a beam from the sword. But the moment you get hit, that goes away, unless you choose to use the fire spell. Just remember, it's good for one screen and one screen only. You'll have to reapply it every time you cross into a new area. A better idea would be to use the life spell to keep that sword beam going. Just make sure to plan that out. Life spell is pretty expensive to cast, only to lose health again if you get hit later, so be smart about it. There are towns scattered across the land. Link can visit them and get a few things out of those towns. There are 2 healers per town, one for life and one for magic. Alright, now look, we're all adults here, right? Even if you aren't, let's pretend for a minute. Is it suspect that these ladies invite Link into the house for healing? Sure, especially with dialogue like this. Is the joke of what's happening? I don't know about you, but I don't typically keep a first aid kit on hand. Not these days, anyway. And I don't know how magic works, but every fantasy thing I've ever seen implies some kind of potion. I wouldn't want to walk around with a bottle of ether or whatever at all times either. Seems like a lot to hold on to. But yeah, towns hold healing and information. Some of it's good and helpful, some of it is not, and rarely these people are monsters in disguise. You can oftentimes find the healers, as they don't really move away from their homes, and anyone else with important information will kind of hang around one specific spot for a while. Pay attention to the colors of the sprites. Healers are purple and red, some important NPCs are orange, and if all else fails, just talk to everybody you can. Just make sure you're ready with a sword stab if you need to take out a monster. On the overworld map, there are areas that will pull you into an instance. These will have items, power-ups, or experience bags to grab. Sometimes there'll be monsters as well. All that's pretty helpful, except maybe the monsters, so try and explore them all if you manage to find them. The only thing that you really need to do when you're on the overworld map, though, is find the palaces, explore those fully, and drop a crystal into the statue at the end of each. To really maximize the levels gained in each location, try to level up just before the boss or as you defeat the boss. Why? Because when you drop the crystal into the statue, you will always gain a level. So it's better to try and use that for when your XP is super low or next to nothing. Otherwise, you'll get that whole level up and maybe you were only like 5 or 50 points out from a level up to begin with, so it's kind of a big waste. On the topic of XP gains, some monsters will actually steal XP from you. It's not a lot, it's usually about 10 or so per hit, but it can add up if you're not careful. By the same token, if you die, you'll lose a life, which honestly isn't all that bad, as the game will spawn you with full magic and life, but if you run out of lives, you'll game over. Continuing from that will start you back in Zelda's Palace with 0 XP to your name, and also I guess you doomed that world to Ganon's return, so, good job. Otherwise, I encourage you to explore the overworld, find as many secrets as you can. You never really know what you might find. Speaking of find, did you manage to find that subscription button down there? How about that like button? If not, why not maybe give it a good smack? Maybe a couple smacks. Just make sure it's an odd number of smacks. Gotta make sure you stay subbed up and whatnot. Really helps with the reach of this small but growing channel. Plus, it tells YouTube that it should be spread around more, and that's always appreciated. Thanks everybody, I appreciate it. Let's jump back into it. I touched on this a bit in the beginning, but how does one make a sequel? Really? The easy answer would seem to be just make it again, but, more. Well, alright, but what is that? What does that look like? You see, in the early years of NES games, a sequel was almost unheard of. In arcades and whatnot, you might get a sequel, but oftentimes it's more like extra levels that didn't quite make it into the original game. Look back again at the lost levels, or, Super Mario Bros. 2. It was literally just more of the original Super Mario Bros. Is that what people wanted? Was that fun for the developers to make? What did that do for the franchise? In the US, when we got Super Mario Bros. 2, it was actually, as I'm sure most of you know, known as Doki Doki Panic in Japan. Why was ours so different? It had a huge emphasis on vertical platforming. We would come to find out later that one reason for this change was because of the difficulty of the original Super Mario Bros. 2, which, fair, it's pretty tough, but not so much that it would warrant such a huge departure from what we knew as Super Mario Bros. As much as I liked the lost levels, or Super Mario Bros. 2, I honestly think we got the better version of Mario 2. It was different. Yeah, absolutely it was. But it was fun and new at the time. Plus, it kind of pushed forward new identities for Mario and the rest of the crew. Castlevania is another instance of strange sequel ideas. The core was similar, sure, you were still slaying evil monsters and whatnot, but the way you went about it was so different. In a lot of ways, it parallels Zelda 2. It adopts certain RPG-like mechanics and involves towns and NPCs that help you. Honestly, even now, developers kind of struggle with making sequels. Sometimes it's just the same game with small updates. You see that pretty much everywhere with any kind of sports title. Or it's so different that it barely identifies as what it says it is. You'd see that most commonly in anthology series, which, fair enough, those are pretty rare in and of themselves. And even then, you have sort of an idea about what to expect. Think about going from Final Fantasy 1 to Final Fantasy 2. The core is still an RPG, but how the game works is completely different. Even the world and characters are different. Are these steps bad to take? Did it ruin what people expected from these games? Because of these changes, were they likely to gain or lose new players? Or even repeat ones? When we look at sequels as the customer, as the purchaser, the consumer, I think we all want something that's similar, for sure, but we also want something kinda new, right? How does a developer make that happen? How can they do that without losing something in the creative process? When you look at game development from the outside, we tend to attribute it to one person, if not maybe a few figureheads. In this case, Miyamoto, right? It's important to remember that there are tons of people who work on games today. The dev team for Zelda 2 was maybe around 10-ish people, but imagine working on Zelda 1 then, and then going right into Zelda 2, and then maybe a third. Then continue all the way to today, with Tears of the Kingdom right around the corner, the 30th Zelda title, Now, sure, new devs came in and old ones left, but without experimentation, would we still be playing a top-down Zelda game? Maybe, it's hard to say. Most 2D Zeldas are still using this format. We saw that with the most recent examples being a remake of Link's Awakening, and before that was The Link Between Worlds. Imagine doing that, making the same game for almost 40 years, and only ever doing small improvements here and there. It would be torturous. I'm sure we can all relate to getting burnt out from our jobs, right? Whatever those might be. Part of that, I think, is the fact that the job becomes routine and kind of boring. Without some kind of creative element mixed in, why continue? Some creative risks are worth it. Sometimes you need to experiment and see what sticks. Not only does it keep the job fun and engaging, but you can learn a ton from the failure. Some of the best advice I ever heard was to fail often and fail faster. You can learn from success, sure, but you really only learn one thing. That thing tends to be that what you did equals your success. Whereas with failure, that teaches you what not to do. Or at least, what changes you need to make if you want to continue trying to make this thing that you're doing happen for you. It encourages experimentation. Were it not for Zelda 2 and all those other 2s from the early NES days, and well, even now, we might not have the kinds of games we enjoy. There is a reality in which Zelda 2 failed horribly and they never got to make A Link to the Past. There's also a world where Zelda 2 was just more of Zelda 1, and that could drastically change how the game is today. All this talk makes me wonder why. Why, for so long, was Zelda 2 considered the black sheep? I think that today, most people like Zelda 2, for the most part. Even on release, it got pretty good numbers and was mostly well-liked. Somewhere along the way, though, it kinda gained a reputation for being the odd one out, like Metroid Fusion would be later down the road. Zelda 2 was looked at by a good chunk of the community as just off. Now, we don't touch the CDI games, alright? Those don't really matter in both the eyes of Nintendo and, well, the fans.
Enough! My ship sails in the morning. I wonder what's for dinner.
Oh boy! I'm so hungry, I could eat an Octorok!
They're great for some memes, though. Zelda 2 gets the side eye because of the differences it has when compared to the rest of the series. It's really the only game that has a side-scrolling perspective. It's the only one that is relentless in terms of difficulty, and it has a strange RPG level system. In some ways, it can be even more cryptic than Zelda 1 was. It has more of an emphasis on action rather than puzzle solving. It's more combat focused, and because of that, it's a bit faster than Zelda 1. The controls work, but they feel like they get in the way rather than being a complement to the game. There aren't really any sub-weapons, no bombs, boomerangs, magic stabs, nothing like that. So the combat feels even stranger because of the lack of ability on Link's end. When compared to the first game, you could drop bombs, shoot arrows, magic, and all kinds of things. Even the passive abilities don't really help out much in combat. The only way to up defense is with a spell, which is super dependent on your magic level and the meter. Not to mention, locked to one screen at a time rather than just being a constant on. Things took a huge turn. This game is Zelda, sure, if only because of the name and who made it, but everything else feels like it doesn't really belong. Or does it? No one can deny that this game is incredibly different when it comes to how the game is played, but at the core, it's still a Zelda game. Over the years, we can see where Zelda 2 has left its mark on the series. Many ideas from this game still live on and sometimes get called back to. Magic spells, level ups, though those took the form of the Piece of Heart containers moving forward. Towns, people, random enemy encounters, side quests, the list kinda just goes on. Was it a risk for them to make changes like this? Absolutely it was. This game is almost nothing like the first, but I would argue it was necessary. I appreciate that over the years people have started to give Zelda 2 a fair shake and view it more as the title it is rather than what people want to think it should be. Is it the best? No, definitely not, but it is unique, even amongst Zelda titles. No doubt about that. Alright, story time. So, real quick, if you don't want to be a part of this, you haven't played it, don't want to get spoiled, here's a skip notation. Go ahead, this timestamp on screen, or if you'd rather, there's a little click down there in the descriptor. Just go ahead and go straight to ending thoughts. So let's give that a second. Okay. Once again, we're going to be looking at this game as it was originally released, not part of the grand lore, not yet. Cool with that for now? We good? Perfect. Let's do this. Being an NES game, the story is once again pretty simplistic. The game does give a brief description if you sit on the title screen for long enough, but otherwise, bust out that manual, it's time to read. The long and short is, long ago, the King of Hyrule used the Triforce to usher in a time of peace and relative prosperity. At some point, though, the king died and the rule was supposed to go to the prince. But the prince wasn't really told about the Triforce, at least not fully. For some reason, the king only told the princess, Zelda. Perhaps the king thought the prince was not ready for the responsibility, and because of that, he hid part of the Triforce away. The prince wasn't exactly happy about that, and with the help of a very clearly evil wizard-type person, he went to go question Zelda. Things went bad right away. Zelda was put to sleep by the wizard, and then the wizard died. Out of grief for his actions, the prince decreed, from that day forward, all females born to the royal family would be named Zelda in her honor to carry out the legend of Zelda. She was placed in some kind of palace for safekeeping, it would seem, until somebody with the mark of the Triforce showed up to fix everything. Impa armed Link with this information and gave him some crystals to go break a barrier. With that, Link sets off to undo the curse placed on Zelda and claim the third and final piece of the Triforce. Impa got real lucky that this Link kid was a hero of prophecy. I imagine just about any other 10-year-old fighting Ganon would have got absolutely crushed immediately. Yeah, in case you didn't know, this is the same Link from the first game. This doesn't happen very often, but some Links span more than just one game. This also means that for some reason this game has two Zeldas. The first one from the original game, the one who split the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces, and now this Sleeping Beauty type Zelda, who's been asleep for generations according to Impa and, well, the game manual. Link at this time is now roughly 16 and has had a lot put onto him. Not enough therapy in the world, I think. It's probably too much for your average 16-year-old to handle, much less, all the stuff he did at 10. But, here we are. Link's adventure is a dangerous one for sure. Lots of caves, woods, swamps, and, palaces to explore and get through. All of them filled to the brim with monsters actively looking to kill Link and mix his blood with the ashes of Ganon so that Ganon can be resurrected. That is more or less the whole story. The thing now is, how do you, as a player, navigate the land of Hyrule and, well, craft your own story? You're gonna want to visit every town, which, fun fact, the town names will be used again later in the series as the names of the sages from Ocarina of Time. Speak with the villagers, explore. Much like the first game, there are secrets everywhere, and many of them are mandatory. Some of the hardest bits are around Death Mountain, the destroyed town of Katsuto, and all the traps that are on the map. Many of them hidden in some weird places that you would almost never really want to go to, and some are so obvious it hurts. But like I said, though, they are mostly all necessary, especially the towns. I cannot stress that enough. Make sure you talk to everybody possible in a town. Do not leave until you either learn a spell, or get an item, or a sword technique, or any kind of combination of those. Once you get to a palace, or temple, or whatever you want to call them, make sure you fully explore that as well. Each one will have at least one item to get. If for any reason you run out of magic and feel you need to leave for health or whatever, try this first. These Iron Knuckle statues, if you do a jump attack on the head of the statue, one of two things can happen. Either you'll get a red magic potion, or you're gonna spawn an Iron Knuckle. And I'm not sure what the spawn rate is, but it's worth the risk. Otherwise, if you leave, you have to fight back to the town, and then once you're healed up, fight your way back, and then fight everything in the palace over again. This little trick can be used in every palace, by the way. Almost any statue can do this, so, give it a shot. It'll be way worth it. Did you fight your way across the land of Hyrule? Did you game over a few times? Hey, it's all good if you did. It happens to the best of us. Once you best each and every palace and defeat the boss at the end of each one, make sure you stop off at the destroyed town and pick up the last spell you need, Thunder. Also, make sure you're as prepared as you can be. The Grand Palace is no joke. It has some of the toughest monsters in the game. If you thought the blue Iron Knuckle was bad, wait until you fight one of these things. The Falca. This blue Falca and this red Falca. Luckily, you never have to fight two Falcas at once, but they'll still mess you up in a 1v1. Definitely shield up and hope you never come across a Mother Falca. Maybe I had too much fun with that. Nah, I'm gonna keep it in. It's worth it. Just to be clear, there's no Mother Falca. It's just that joke was right there. I mean, I had to, right? The name alone. Okay then. Once you get all the way to the end and face the final boss, Thunderbird, what spell do you think you might need here? You duke it out, and, should you come out on top, you place the last crystal in the statue and move towards the final room. Here you're greeted with this gnome, dwarf, I don't know, this bearded fella, and one last trial awaits. You see, the reason the Triforce was split by the king is because if someone with an impure heart claims all the pieces of it, they can bring untold devastation to the land of Hyrule. This is why the old king split it off and hid it away from the prince. He must have not thought him worthy of the power it brings and was trying to protect the land. Did it work? I don't know, maybe. Hyrule survived for a good long while until Ganon appeared, and it seems to be recovering in part thanks to Link, so I guess it all worked out. At any rate, to test the lad, they make you fight Shadow Link, or Dark Link. I guess it depends on how you want to look at it, I suppose. You have the power and the wisdom to survive the trials up to this point, and you faced all of it with the courage one would need to overcome it all. In this last trial, face yourself and overcome it. This fight is brutal. Dark Link holds nothing back, and you really have to fight for your life here. Or you could just go into the back corner here, crouch and stab away. GG. Easy. Honestly, no shame if you do this. This fight is beyond brutal if you try to do it legit. And I did, man. That Switch Rewind is a godsend. Anyway, once you defeat yourself, claim the last piece of the Triforce and go and wake up the sleeping Princess Zelda. The curtain falls and Link gets a kiss. You get a final message and the credits roll. Unlike the first game, there's not really a second quest, but you can play through the game again with all the level ups you got, so, you can absolutely destroy the first few areas of the game, which can be fun, but is it worth it? I don't know, maybe, that's up to you. Okay, gonna play a joke on those who jumped ahead. If you see this bit, you're in on it, alright? Just play along with the comments, something about a twist ending, make it vague, keep it as spoiler-free as possible, and for those of you that were curious about it and watched the story section got to this part, after reading all the comments, you're in on it now too. Alright, keep the joke going. It'll be at least that funny, I promise. We can do this. It'll be worth it. Alright, so welcome back to all those who jumped ahead a little bit, and to everybody else who got through that story bit. Man, good times, am I right? Who would have thought Nintendo would do that? Speaking of, I talked a good bit about intention and how one tries to go about making a sequel. Now, I'm no programmer, I'm not even really a developer. I'm just a guy that looks a little bit too hard at the in-betweens. In between the lines. For what it's worth, Zelda 2 is unique amongst its peers in the Zelda landscape. It's not nearly as bad as some people make it out to be, but it can be super unforgiving and really difficult at times. For all of its shortcomings and faults, it's still pretty fun to play. Don't really recommend it though, unless you're 100% in on playing all of the Zelda games. If you do attempt it, my advice is go slow. Take some time to level up when you can. It'll make things that much easier for you as you go to make progress. For me, I have a strange relationship with this game. I played it a bunch when I was stuck traveling back in 2011. I had a 3DS that had that Ambassador game program thing on it. You remember. And if you don't, here's a quick rundown. The 3DS was a little overpriced when it first came out, so to make up for that, Nintendo gave first wave 3DSs this little pass, and it let you download specific titles. Zelda 2 was one of those. And it was during that time, when I was stuck in a bunk room waiting for travel details, that it kinda grew on me. I think I was stuck waiting for about 2 to 3 days, and in that time I crushed this game, as well as Metroid Fusion. Still have that 3DS today. So for me, I might be looking at it with some level of fondness. Don't get me wrong though, it's still rough. Everything that was odd about the first game is still, well, just as odd here, just with way less bombs and way more awkward controls. This game can be fun, but you have to approach it as it was presented back in 1988. Be slow and be methodical. The game will still be a little jank and it's gonna frustrate you. That said, it is worth it, at least a little bit, if you're the type who can stomach some older games. This is going to do it for the NES Zelda titles. Next time we'll be moving on to the Super Nintendo, and with that, making a link to the past. I'll be seeing you then. Hey everybody, welcome to the end card. So if you made it here, thanks for hanging. Got one more Zelda game to go, then we'll take a small detour into some Castlevania-style games. Gotta try and keep it fresh, you know? On that note, actually, the next few Zeldas are gonna be the handheld ones. I'm talking Link's Awakening and the Oracle games. Got something planned for those, but that might take a bit, so, you know, a little patience would be appreciated, thank you. In the meantime, take it easy and be your best self. I'll see you next time.